It's customary for me, of course, in a setting like this to start by honouring country, by acknowledging country, and of course I recognise that we are all working and living and talking today on Wurundjeri country. What I want to really start today with is the problem of what does it mean to say that we're on Wurundjeri country, and what does it mean to say that we acknowledge the peoples of the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded territory we conduct the business of the university. So I'm going to pick out a couple of key phrases there and really try and trouble away at them a little bit. What does it mean to think about country? What does it mean to think about sovereignty? So I'm sorry, this is the only ugly slide that's a very professorial slide with lots of words in it. This was partially for me to remember what it was that I wanted to say with all of you today, so I apologise for that. Think 3000 I'm taking as a lovely provocation to lean into the work of thinking. Now, as academics, this is a very familiar work, thinking together. As academics, we research, we teach. What does it mean to think together? And I'm taking Kyriakos' lovely provocation here today with Think 3000 as an opportunity to imagine, to reimagine what thinking together means. Scholarship is typically understood as a fairly solitary activity. We as academics work on our own, sometimes with groups, and we publish our work and we share it that way. What does it mean to think differently together? What does it mean to think politically about the work of thinking? What does it mean to honour country in Naarm? Now, I'm going to use that language of Naarm because my sense is that something very distinctive is happening here in Melbourne at the moment as we, some of us, imagine ourselves living in Naarm rather than perhaps more conventional ways of thinking about the city-state. So I want to think about what does it mean to honour country in Naarm? What kinds of ethical problems does that present for us? What kinds of opportunities and invitations does it present? I want to lean in today to the idea of the intellectual labour involved in this work, because I think this is very powerful. This is, I suppose, the backstory here is that thinking about the failed referendum last year, a lot of us in Melbourne felt very despondent about that result. That was not the result. And I'm going to use the we here, and that is a really politically important gesture. The we is to think about who is the community for which the referendum result was disappointing, because it's to recognise in this country that there are a lot of people who celebrated that outcome. But that's a kind of language is powerful, right? Language is a political gesture, the kind of language with which we express a particular feeling about a particular outcome. So I suppose that I have to take responsibility for that, my own frustration. But it's to think about in the wake of the referendum, recognising that a huge amount of political progress was made in this city because in this city, we voted differently. We voted for progressive change. We voted for a different kind of way of thinking about country and a different way of thinking about our obligations to First Peoples in this country, in this state. So in some respects, I look at this as an opportunity to build on a foundation of goodwill. What's the intellectual labour involved in that, though? In the wake of the referendum, I started to think about what's the thing that I can contribute with my colleagues, with my students, with the friends and people that I work with. What's the thing that I can contribute? To the extent that I'm good at anything, I'm possibly good at this bit. Thinking with others, thinking out loud. I recognise that there's not always great demand for that, but occasionally we think together and we think well together. So if I think about what's the value of thinking about these problems in the wake of the referendum result, I think that there's a huge importance in the idea of thinking about our values. And I think all day we've been talking about values in the way that the double balance in which values are talked about, the value of something, the values by which we make decisions about the things that we value. That's really important, to be articulate about our values and to talk about them more explicitly and to share those values. That's really important. What are the values that drive the things that we do? That's really important. The second part, and perhaps the second part is the more slightly conventional academic thing, is to begin to plan and organise. According to our values, what are the things that we think might work? How do we change? How do we make political progress? How do we do that? Now, if we think about honouring country in Naarm, this is a more conventional way of thinking about First Peoples in this city. We think about disadvantage. I've done a fair bit of work in recent years on housing and homelessness issues. And of course, First Peoples are massively, disgracefully overrepresented in every measure that we use to indicate the scale of our housing problem. This is a very conventional picture of First Peoples in this city. This is another one. I took this photo in a laneway in my neighbourhood. I live in Carlton North. I took this photo in a laneway in my neighbourhood just the other day. This is, Melbourne's got a great stencil art tradition, a great political stencil art tradition. I see this as an iteration of that great tradition, but it's also something really interesting. What would drive someone, and my feeling here is that this is probably a group of people who are doing this, what would drive people to make this stencil? This is, sorry if you can't read the font there, Colonial Frontier Massacres in Australia, 1788 to 1930. Australia's in scare quotes. Love it, I'm a political theorist. As soon as you start seeing scare quotes, you see an indication of contest. Whose country is this? What's Australia? But a lovely map of frontier violence. Aren't we trying to tell the truth about the history of this country in this? Isn't this a really powerful political gesture that tells us something really significant? Who wants to stencil that on the side of, this is a florist in Carlton North, you know what I mean? Who wants to stencil this on the side of a florist in Carlton North? Now I think about this, I was walking past with my son and we stopped and we talked about it. Now, the thing that made me stop and take a photo was that I kind of feel like this is more powerful than anything I've ever done as an academic. Of all the things that I do, talking to other people, Tara, you had the great call out today, we've got to get outside of the bubble. This is still inside the bubble. This is way, way, way inside the bubble, right? But it's still talking. But I'm thinking as a piece of political communication, incredibly effective, I think. A more conventional piece of political communication, the things that academics normally do, write very learned books about big, big problems. I want to lean into more of this because this is really good. You know, like these two books are really, really good. Henry Reynolds, very famous Australian historian. Marcia Langton, equally famous. I don't need to tell you how important that work is. But what if we try and learn from that? How do we honour country on the basis of an understanding of our history that is different, that tells a different kind of story, that tells the truth? What does it mean if we try and understand our truth a bit more? What kinds of ways of understanding our history derive from an Indigenous way of knowing? What do I know about that? Nothing. I'm stupid. I've got to learn more, right? Thank God this technology was invented. You know, I was in Chris Speed's session just before, and he talked about the value of having a notebook, an old technology, a notebook, a blank notebook, carrying a notebook with you and making notes. This is a lovely, yeah, it works, right? Yeah, I mean, old guys, we tend to get that, right? I'll speak for myself. But this is a lovely old technology. You know, I bought that book in Readings in Carlton, you know, in a physical bookstore, went in, bought the book, went home and read it. I mean, that was really time well spent. Understanding sovereignty. There is no bigger problem in Western conventional political science than the idea of sovereignty. The idea of sovereignty is the foundation of the state. Big brains have been arguing about sovereignty since the beginning of time. What does it mean when you put an Indigenous stamp on that problem? When we have Indigenous ways of knowing sovereignty, what does that look like? How do we reimagine sovereignty in a way that is decolonizing the idea of the colony itself? Like, get your brain inside that idea, right? How do you decolonize the idea of the colony? Even just saying it makes my head hurt. But that's the problem, right? That's the problem. How do we understand sovereignty otherwise than the trope that we've been given? The idea of sovereignty as the idea of a mythical foundation, as a sovereign right. So, with that by way of preamble, how do we come to know our history differently by telling the truth? What kind of intellectual work would that involve? Making sense of things, learning about our history, talking about it, arguing about it. That's a very old-fashioned way of thinking about politics, the idea of an informed citizenry that talks about big problems and tries to through that process of dialogue, come up with some ways forward. Honouring country in Naarm, if we use that language of Naarm, who are the citizens of Naarm? I don't know. I've got a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. My 16-year-old is constantly talking about Naarm, talking about fashion in Naarm. It's a look, apparently. It's a language that he and his social group are starting to use to talk about the city. I find that really, really interesting. I don't think he's appropriating a cultural language that's not his. He's 16. I don't think he's thinking like that yet. He hasn't read enough Derrida yet to get that bit right. But he's just thinking about a language to talk about his community. The way he uses it makes me think he's becoming a citizen of Naarm because he's thinking about country. He's thinking about his obligations in some new ways. He's also thinking about whether jorts and sandals go together, but that's okay, right? If I think about politics, I think about who are the publics for whom our politics is a process by which we solve our problems. So the politics always presupposes a public. There is a people for whom politics is a process by which we solve problems. So who are the people of Naarm that would honour country in Naarm? This is about reinventing a particular kind of public. This is the job of thinking in the city, is how do we think together to try and find ways to address problems of sovereignty together. So it requires the work of creating new publics. The second aspect is knowing country is a way of dwelling in the city differently. How do we live in the city in a way that is responsible, that honours country in particular distinctive kinds of ways? What would that even involve? How would we do that? In universities, we have a very now customary way of acknowledging country at the start of all our meetings. Is that all it is? Is that, it's got to be a bit more than that. That's the easy bit, the kind of performativity of honouring country. That's pretty straightforward. It doesn't cost me anything. What would a more meaningful way of dwelling in place, of living in Naarm, comfortably, responsibly with others, in peace with others, what would that look like? So there's a placemaking piece to it as well. The big part of it is, and the bit that I think is the most mysterious, is this idea of what kinds of new structures of feeling, ways of feeling and living in the city. This is, I'll get to it in a moment, but a critically important part of dwelling in place is the idea of a feeling of belonging. We all get that. But the stencil art that I showed you before, that's a really powerful call to action, right? I'm supposed to feel something when I see that. I encounter that piece of stencil art and I'm confronted with a reality about the truth of our history. I can't not think about that or not feel something about that. So what kinds of new structures of feeling? In political science, there's a sense that oftentimes, sometimes for better, mostly for the worse, Trump is a great example of this, that the idea of an affective call is really powerful in politics, that we don't understand the content as much as we understand the sentiment or the feeling. Trump is a great illustration of that, right? So I've said here, a new post-colonial sovereign counter-public in and for Naarm. That's a ugly, ugly sentence that people who have read too many of the wrong books tend to say. I'm sorry for that, but it's a really shorthand way of thinking about, okay, post-colonial, how do we get to this point? How do we imagine after the colony? I'm thinking about Achille Mbembe and his work on the just colony. How do we get to the just colony? Okay, that's a big problem. This counter-public, what I mean there is I'll get to the book in a minute, what I mean there is, who are the people for whom Naarm is a powerful way of reimagining the city? If I think about all the great things that we're doing at RMIT, what would City North Naarm look like? You know what I mean? What would the social innovation precinct in Naarm look like? Some of the things that we've heard about today. Okay, so 3 big problems. These are, again, I'm an academic, I read a lot, that's what I do, right? I'm trying to share. My wife is a painter, and I had a really, really lovely conversation with her about 6 months ago when I was hitting a block with my work, and she said, artists, we always come back to our practice. And so she said to me, Cameron, what's your practice? And I thought, I don't, my practice, I don't know. And she's like, man, the place is surrounded, the home is surrounded by books. That's your practice, you read a lot. So I realized that's to the extent that that's useful, and I'm going to share some of that with you, I hope it's useful. I love this book. Publics and Counterpublics. Michael Warner, key figure at the birth of queer theory in the United States in the 1980s and into the 1990s, wrote this lovely book that had a very different audience in mind. It's a book about how publics form. This is a powerful book for understanding how counterpublics form. His idea was that there is the public, the public that identifies in a conventional way with a polity and a state and a politics, and then there's counterpublics. His book was written at the birth of HIV/AIDS activism. That was his counterpublic. The counterpublic of gay activists who are looking to reimagine ways out of HIV. There's great work in the ocean of thinking about counterpublics that honour country in Naarm. Doreen Massey, towering figure in geography, writing about feminist accounts of place. This is really lovely. She's the one that helped us understand what place is, what placemaking involves. Place is a powerful affective anchor. I feel something in place. I am drawn to places because of the way they make me feel. What kinds of ways of understanding place might help us think about honouring country here in Naarm in different kinds of ways? There's a critically important role in thinking about place and placemaking. Doreen Massey is an incredibly important figure in this respect. Raymond Williams' Structures of Feeling, critically important innovation in the way we think about this book about literature. His idea, the big idea in this book, there's lots of big ideas in this book, is that literature functions by organising feeling. I am drawn to great novels for the way they make me feel about characters, for the way I understand the organisation of character. He talks about that as there are particular distinctive structures of feeling. Politics is grounded in structures of feeling. I feel this way about a candidate. I feel this way about a party. I feel this way about a political campaign. I feel this way about a set of political issues. What kinds of new structures of feeling can we manipulate, make sense of, harness, or engineer to make us feel differently about place? There's a critically important role for creative arts practice in this bit. That's why I wanted to show you the stencil art. There's art making is an affective practice of engineering feelings. So what kinds of roles can we find for creative arts practitioners to help us think about how do we connect with country in different ways? How do we connect with each other in different ways? Our politics is broken at the moment, obviously, right? We talk about that all the time, but like your point, Tara, how do we stop saying that it's impossible, so that I'm out of the way of the people who are trying to make it different, right? Trying to do it a different way. If we want to unfuck our politics, how do we do that? We do it by thinking about different structures of feeling, different ways of connecting with each other. Those experiments are happening around us all the time. On digital platforms, in face-to-face interactions, people posting stencil art outside Florist and North Carlton to try and get you to feel something different. I just wanted to, it was impossible for me to think about how could I do something useful in a short time frame like this, but I thought, okay, these are the big ideas that I'm troubling over in my mind. How do we think about, in the wake of the referendum, how do we think about the next kinds of things that we might do, those of us who care about these sorts of political problems? What are the next kinds of things that we might do? Honouring country is a language that I feel provides a useful way of thinking about what we can do in this city. In an event like Think 3000, what do we do in this city? What are our responsibilities here? Honouring country in Naarm, there's a critically important role for publics, the way we come together to talk about ideas together. There's a critically important role for placemaking and new experiences of the city. And this bit, thinking about our feelings and the way we connect with each other, is powerful as well. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.